Welcome back, class. This is AGR2 IPM, and in today's lecture we're going to look at an introduction to integrated pest management, or IPM. The current best practice for dealing with pests in broadacre crops and pastures is simply to apply insecticides. So farmers are simply asked to match up the pest and the pesticide, which doesn't require a great deal of knowledge about the pest species, as it usually involves the selection of a broad spectrum pesticide, which then deals with a range of pests. And although a relatively recent approach historically, the use of pesticides is not likely to be sustainable, because where reliance on pesticides alone has been employed, then pesticide resistance has led to crop failures. Integrated pest management, or IPM, is not a common tool used by most broadacre farmers in cropping and pastures. It's actually in its infancy still in Australia and elsewhere in the world. But it will happen in consultation with entomologists who specialise in the field. At this stage, IPM can't control all pests in all crops, but we can still use basic principles to guide in the implementation of IPM in Australia. Currently, growers that adopt IPM are still trying to define the full list of pests on their property. IPM involves integrating three different types of control options: biological controls, cultural controls, and chemical controls. But note that biological and cultural controls are the mainstays of IPM. Chemical controls are never used as the primary control options. Biological control may involve pathogens such as viruses or bacteria, parasites, for example other insects or even nematodes, and predators such as other insects and mites. And note also that predators can also be larger animals and birds. Mostly the biological control agents used in IPM are native species. This includes generalist predators, which will quite readily accept native and exotic species of pests as their prey, and also specialist parasitic species, for example, parasitoids. Parasitic species tend to have quite a narrow host range. Cultural control can also include the use of genetically modified crops. The generally accepted method of pest control since the 1950s has been the use of synthetic pesticides, and we tend to rely quite heavily on these chemicals that are synthesised by chemists. The first of these were the organochlorines, including DDT, dieldrin, lindane, heptachlor, and endosulfan. Later came the organophosphates and carbamates, and then the synthetic pyrethroids. Since the 1980s, the organochlorines have been banned in Australia. So synthetic pesticide, or rather the synthetic pesticide era, has become accepted as the conventional approach to pest management. But obviously the control of pests was achieved by other methods for hundreds of years without these chemicals. So it's actually not the conventional approach that we might think. Broad spectrum pesticides, which make up the conventional approach, are usually not compatible with an IPM approach that incorporates biological control agents. So let's just sum up the use of organophosphates and synthetic pyrethroids here. They're the current basis of pest control. They're cheap, they're broad spectrum, so it's not necessary to know the target species, but they also kill predatory and parasitic species. So why is the pesticide-based approach used? Well, it's simple, it's easy to understand, easy to apply. Therefore, it's been widely adopted over the last 60 years or so. Let's look at some disadvantages to this approach. Insecticide resistance, residues in produce, worker safety, non-target mortality, induced secondary pests, environmental contamination, and drift into neighbouring properties. Now, we can ignore points 2 to 7 by those determined to ignore them. But point number 1, insecticide resistance, cannot be ignored by farmers that are relying on pesticides. So what are the options here? They become increase the dose, change the active ingredient, or do something altogether different. And this different approach, IPM, was developed as an alternative. Now, keep in mind that chemical control is a part of IPM strategies, but the challenge here is to use chemicals as a support tool, not as the primary means of control. Let's look at some advantages of using IPM. Massively reduced insecticide use, reduced costs, reduced exposure to chemicals, improved pest control, healthier, more productive plants, avoidance of insecticide resistance, and avoidance of secondary pests. Can you achieve high quality products utilising IPM? The reason for heavy pesticide use is that it's the only way to achieve high quality products. So the inference here is that IPM, which allows living organisms to live in the crop, can't achieve this type of outcome. Let's look at the example of glasshouse grown roses. It's not a food crop, so it's sold on cosmetic value alone. The standards of pest management are very high, and growers rely very heavily on pesticides until, that is, resistance became a problem. Those that then adopted IPM had better control of pests, fewer pesticide applications, plants were healthier and more robust, which meant longer stems, which are usually worth more in the marketplace than short-stemmed roses. So benefits after adopting IPM should include increases in quality and yield. One of the earliest criticisms of IPM came about from this article published by Pickett and Bug in 1998. And they stated that there was too much reliance on the use of pesticides in IPM strategies. But in fact, too much reliance on pesticides and true IPM has not been practiced. Rather, in many cases, an alternative spray strategy is used, and that's called IPM. So the problem is that a farmer might fail in the first case, and whatever they tried is labelled as IPM. So there's a massive potential then for this problem to be repeated, and a bad perception of IPM is generated. The first task to implementing IPM is pest identification, but pest ID is difficult. A farmer or an agronomist is usually not able to say what range of pests they're trying to combat on their farm. It's not a straightforward task. The pest spectrum will often increase once broad spectrum chemicals are ceased, but this doesn't mean that pest problems will necessarily increase. This actually depends on many local factors, and especially the relative number of pests to beneficials. This table presents a very simple means of summarising an IPM strategy for any crop or pasture anywhere. And this enables you to identify what actions will be required and what information is lacking. So have a good look at the information presented in this table. We have our known pests listed in column 1, any beneficial predators or parasites, known cultural controls, chemical controls, and then methods of monitoring. So the first step is to identify the range of pests, and this probably won't be known until the broad spectrum pesticides are withdrawn, but there will be local knowledge. Some will be more important than others, so it's worth categorising the pests as major pests or minor pests, and either regular or infrequent pests. So let's start with column 1, and this involves listing the identified pests in order. So major pests first, followed by the minor or infrequent pests. And this approach allows us to see the most serious pest problem and where most of the effort should be directed. It also allows us to see the seriousness of applying harsh insecticides for minor pests. So for example, this is a hypothetical IPM strategy for canola. So applying a synthetic pyrethroid spray for aphids, which you can see here is a minor pest of this particular crop, would have grave effects on the biological control of major pests, which are identified here as the slugs, earwigs and mites. The second part of this IPM strategy for canola is to identify key beneficial species. That is, the biological controls that may prey on or parasitise each of the major pests. Once again, there's not much information about many of these beneficials in broadacre farming or experience in using them, but there's certainly enough information to identify likely beneficials. So for example, the carabid beetles listed here are a group that contains many predatory species, and we know that they are generalist predators that feed on soft-bodied prey. This beneficials list will change as more information becomes available in the future. The third column here deals with a large and diverse set of control options that are referred to as cultural controls, and many of these are management practices that are carried out often for other purposes. So for example, the time of planting will influence the risk of aphid-vectored diseases in cereals. Burning stubble will affect the number of pests and beneficials that are actually resident. Grazing intensity will affect the risk of damage by cockchafers. So different management options will be available to each farmer, and each individual will have different thoughts on what's sustainable for their own situation. It's important to note that there are a range of options and some of them are highly effective, but to ignore any of them may critically weaken the IPM strategy by placing too much reliance on the biological components or just the cultural components of any IPM strategy. Weed management that you can see here, weed control, is a common control method in IPM. So for example, the red-legged earth mite flourishes on broadleaf weeds such as capeweed. So control of this helps to suppress the pest. But it has to be done the year before the susceptible crop is grown, which is before the over-summering eggs are produced, not just with a herbicide at the time of planting. Some cultural practices will have a major impact on pests, other will have a minor impact. So they're all listed here so the farmer can decide which ones are worth the effort. The final control option is the use of chemical pesticides, and these are selected to be effective on pests but not disruptive to any beneficials. Often this is not possible, but there's certainly an ever-increasing number of products that are not lethal to all beneficial species. Now, to illustrate the difference between an IPM approach and what's shown here as a targeted pesticide approach, we're going to look at the control of red-legged earth mite. Australian entomologists have developed an approach to controlling red-legged earth mite called the time right strategy, and this is based on the fact that this mite produces over-summering eggs that are quite hardy. They can survive desiccation. If the population is killed before these eggs are produced, then there shouldn't be a problem in the following season. So an insecticide is applied in spring, either organophosphates or synthetic pyrethroids. And they're applied at a time known in any location to be just before these resistant eggs are produced. And although this will kill most of the red-legged earth mite, it also kills the species that actually help to control it. And also these species would help to control other potential pests. So although time right is one means of achieving control, it's not an IPM strategy. In contrast, using an IPM strategy, the aim is to use the best chemical product given the beneficial species listed in column 2 of our table on the previous slide. That is, using a pesticide that will control the pest but with minimal impact on the beneficials. And the range of beneficials will almost certainly be different in different regions or at different times of the year. So the selected chemical pesticide could also be different. Now our final column, monitoring, has been completed. And the role of monitoring is to identify the pest and beneficial spectrum at any particular time. And this enables accurate decisions to be made for each and every site. But it requires that the individual knows what to look for and how to identify it. It might sound simple to find advisors skilled in identifying beneficials as well as the pests, but this is not easy. Individuals also need to know how to make decisions based on the results of this type of assessment. So with this information added into the last column, the IPM strategy is now complete. The term IPM was first put forward in the 1950s by Stern, Smith and Hagen, published in 1959, and it was published as the integration of biological, cultural and chemical methods to achieve better control of pests. Farms can be referred to as agricultural ecosystems. They're not sterile laboratories, so soil biology and biodiversity are essential for productive farming systems. So from here, it shouldn't be a great step to accept that there are other macroinvertebrates that contribute to the health of the ecosystem. For example, species that actively decompose plant materials such as stubble, species that prey on pests, and others that are not pests or predators, but which provide one of those important links in the food chain. Let's consider the question, why do insects become pests? And we've dealt with this extensively in a previous lecture, but it's certainly worth revisiting. So some things that farmers do can fundamentally change the agricultural ecosystems that they manage. So for example, changing to no-till changes the habitat for soil-dwelling invertebrates in quite a substantial way. And the most immediate result seen by farmers is increased pest problems, particularly snails, slugs and earwigs. So change in habitat leads to changed environmental conditions, and these often favour certain pests because these new conditions provide an increased food source and increased shelter. So habitat change is just one reason for increased pest problems in the last few years. Most farmers grow monocultures of crops where the aim is to produce a single species that will be harvested. So for example, a paddock of canola or wheat, normally treated with herbicides, to ensure the crop has no competition, and maybe also treated for pests so the crop remains intact until harvest. So the emphasis is on the production of a single species per paddock. Even in pastures, the aim is to provide a desirable species of grass to produce a single animal species, such as sheep or cattle. If broad-spectrum insecticides are used, then no competitors or natural enemies remain. So these are killed, while any pests that are resistant to the chemicals will survive. The result is a resistant pest with an almost limitless food supply. In Australia, we have pests such as the diamond-back moth and Heliothis, which are resistant to many insecticides, and they're of major concern to many farmers. In fact, diamond-back moth is the first crop pest in the world to develop resistance to DDT. A common method of creating pest problems in the first place is by the regular use of broad-spectrum pesticides, which sounds surprising because pesticide use is aimed at reducing pest problems, but this can occur in a few different ways. Secondary pests are created when a pesticide targeting a primary pest kills the natural enemies of a different species which is tolerant to that pesticide. For example, using a pesticide to kill the cabbage white butterfly, which is native to Europe and it was brought to Australia in the 1860s, might kill them, but also kills the natural enemies of the diamondback moth, which may then survive and turn into secondary pests. We have a similar situation in cropping systems. So broad spectrum chemicals target red-legged earth mite. However, the predators of the blue oat mite are also killed. So then suddenly you have an increase in blue oat mite, which becomes the major pest. The blue oat mite is pictured here. It's about 1 millimetre in length, and note it has a reddish spot on its back. It's also possible in many cropping situations that applications of chemicals such as those targeting caterpillars or aphids are actually killing the generalist predators like carabid beetles and earwigs that help to control slugs and mites. And research shows that this occurs quite often. Contamination pests. These are pests that don't cause any damage to the crop, but they're still considered pests in some circumstances. So, for example, in export produce. They're actually contaminants rather than pests, but they're still dealt with as pests. It's important to consider the fact that major pests and minor pests can change with the type of crop grown. That is, not all pests are equal in the amount of damage they do in a particular situation. So, for example, the black-headed pasture cockchafers are major pests, and white-fringed weevils are minor pests in pasture. But the weevils can become a major pest if a susceptible crop such as potatoes is planted. Any crop or pasture has its own set of potential pests, and these of course vary from place to place. Managing these factors falls under the heading of cultural control, and we list some important factors here. Starting with weeds. The level of certain weeds over summer can actually increase populations of pests. So, for example, broadleaf weeds such as capeweed is a highly suitable host for red-legged earth mite, which will breed on it and lay summer dormant eggs. These will hatch after rainfall in autumn. So planting susceptible crops such as clover or canola in paddocks that had high levels of capeweed the previous winter can be expected to suffer damage from red-legged earth mite. Next important factor, bare ground and animal manure. So paddocks with lots of bare ground and animal manure are expected to have high levels of black-headed cockchafers. The adult beetles lay their eggs in bare ground, and they will lay more eggs if they've had a dung meal. So you would expect to see more of these in overgrazed paddocks and in drought years. The next factor, timing of planting. This can have a huge influence on the level of damage. So for example, in southeastern Australia, canola planted early in autumn will spend less time as vulnerable seedlings than later planted crops, simply because the weather gets colder as we move from April to May and then June. So the crop grows quickly, and it's likely to have fewer damaged plants for any given level of pests. The opposite situation exists for early planted cereals. They tend to have a much greater risk of barley yellow dwarf virus, and this is because insects, including aphids, are still active and flying when the weather is still relatively warm in early autumn, but they're less of a problem as the weather starts to cool. Plant health, of course, can affect the incidence and severity of pest and disease attack. Even very healthy plants can be attacked, but stressed plants are more vulnerable. Aphids, for example, are often associated with less healthy plants. And this can be seen on the edges of many crops where fertiliser applications may have been missed, or fungicide coverage is less than ideal, so the plants may not be as healthy. The same occurs on the edge of irrigated crops, where the outer plants may not receive the same amount of irrigation as the bulk of the crop. Soil preparation, of course, is also important. When crops are planted into very cloddy soil, poorer germination rates and greater damage by pests such as slugs can occur. Better protection is provided to slugs by cloddy ground, and this combined with slower germination and growth of plants means more damage for the same density of pests. Current desirable practices include stubble retention and minimal tillage. So pest management practices have to change to accommodate this. Slugs and wireworms take advantage of this changed habitat, and you can see a slug pictured here. So these become more important pests in these areas. So with all these factors considered, including of course pesticide application, it's quite easy to see that there are many actions over which farmers have control that also have a great impact on pest pressure in any given location. Some factors, of course, can't be controlled. For example, neighbouring crops and weather conditions. As an example, Heliothis can invade crops from long distances away, as well as the diamondback moth and the Rutherglen bug. In some of these images, you can see Heliothis caterpillars on various hosts, including tomato, chili and cotton. Action thresholds have been developed and used for many years in Australian, and the theory is that no action is required until pests reach a level that will cause economic damage. Threshold numbers, that is the number of pests in a given sample, are the trigger for pesticide application. Here we can see a couple of examples. The first one involves the pea weevil, and the recommendation is that you spray if you find 2 or more beetles in 25 sweeps along an edge of a crop, repeated 10 times. Another example involves canola crops. Spray if you find more than 5 to 10 caterpillars per square metre. Here we have some action thresholds summarised in a GRDC advice sheet. and this is for cereals and canola. These action thresholds should not be used on their own according to IPM strategies. The problem with thresholds is that they don't take the many variables into account. So for example, given a number of pests, how much damage would they cause with X, Y or Z beneficial species present? How much damage would they cause with or at different planting dates, with different weather conditions, different value of crops at different times, different value of crops in different years. So these variables make it impossible to say that a particular pest means a set level of economic loss. In some situations where there's no beneficial species present, the threshold can be accurate, but usually there's no simple association between pest numbers and economic damage. So for example, an early planted canola crop sown into well-prepared ground with good germination will tolerate a higher number of establishment pests than the same crop sown later or sown into cloddy ground. If the pest is a viral disease vector, then the use of thresholds becomes even more complicated. Often it appears that bad damage has occurred early on in a crop, but this sometimes can be tolerated and the plants eventually grow normally. But the problem for the farmer and for the agronomist is to know this with confidence before the opportunity to apply an appropriate insecticide has passed. So it's currently difficult to assess the true cost of pesticides, which makes the use of thresholds even more difficult. We need to know both the cost of lost beneficials in a paddock and about subsequent flare of pests in both the current crop and future crops before we can decide on the economics of using a non-selective insecticide.